My name is MPNA Oct, and I'm the president of the Meridian Park Neighborhood Association. And if you live in Meridian Park neighborhood, which is the boundaries of which are North 160th Street to 185th on the south side of 185th, and I-5 over to Aurora, you are automatically a member of Meridian Park Neighborhood Association. No dues required, nothing to sign up, you're automatically a member. So welcome. And the agenda for this evening is that the first part, first 20 minutes or so, is going to be our city manager, Debbie Terry, and Tricia Yunke. Is Tricia going to be here too?
Yes, she
and she's the city engineer.
That's correct.
Are going to be giving a presentation about what Proposition 1 is. And then after that, then we're going to pull this table out and we are going to have Nicholas Miriam and Dustin McIntyre, who are representative of the Yes campaign and the No campaign, field our questions. So we can do a little bit deeper dive into any questions that come up around the presentation that we have. And also any questions that just come up. So, and also we can ask questions of Debbie and Tricia along the way as well. So, let's do just a really quick little icebreaker to go around the room. Not everybody's been here before. There's some familiar faces, but some that are not. So how about really quickly, say your name and then also something you like about the fall season. Why don't you go first, Dustin?
Yeah, so Dustin, so let's see, and I'll admit I'm from Ridgecrest, just across that project, but thank you for inviting me. The fall season, I will admit, a big football fan, but more to the point, I think Sounders playoff. So,
Great.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Give me
And
more
just that was perfect, Dustin. Just be as brief as you can, because we're going to get started with Debbie right after this. So go ahead, Nicholas.
Nicholas, and I love sunny days with a crisp fall wind.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
I'm Leon, and I enjoy the return of the rain.
Great.
I'm Fanny, and I like the colors of the leaves changing.
Great, thank you.
Name is Jack, and I like to pick the leaves up.
Great.
I'm Debbie, and I actually like to pick the leaves because of the noise they make in the fall.
Great.
Tom, I find the fall to be tremendously invigorating, and we get rid of this doggone sun.
I'm Louise, and I live a block away, and I do not like fall because that means winter's right behind, and I don't like being cold.
Right with you there, Louise.
I'm Louise. I also love the colors.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Julie. Yeah, I like the color change. It's so beautiful right now on the street. Yeah. And yesterday when I passed through the Meridian Avenue, I took pictures.
Walter?
I'm Walter, and I like, there's different kinds of mushrooms pop out of the ground.
Pete, he's ski season's only 2 months away.
Okay. Tricia?
And I'm Tricia, and I like fall because it's soccer season.
Nice. Let's see, I'm Sophia, and I have mixed feelings about fall. I really like the fall days when it's sunny and crisp, but when that rain starts happening, I really want to get the heck out of here. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Debbie Terry, our city manager, and Tricia Yunke, our city engineer.
Great, thank you. And we're going to talk from the hard copies of the presentation because we're having trouble getting our computer to show up on the projector. So it won the battle tonight. Stop fighting that. But Tricia and I are going to take kind of turns. She's actually going to go ahead and start off. Cynthia asked us to come and talk about Proposition 1. It is a ballot measure that will be on the November general election. And just to be clear, as city employees here, we can talk about the facts about Proposition 1. That's what we'll be presenting, and we're glad to answer any questions. But but we cannot advocate for or against the proposition. So it's not our intent to do that, but it is our intent to provide you information and be responsive to your questions. So I'll go ahead and let Tricia get started.
All right, well, I am going to kick this off. So as probably most of you know, that Shoreline's a relatively new city.
Yep.
Can I
But
just,
she's gonna be going by these slides
Yeah.
yeah,
too.
these slides,
Yeah.
yeah. Just, you don't get the color and I don't get to click through, but still the elements. So, the infrastructure though is not new, and most of our neighborhoods were built when it was part of King County in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And when the city first incorporated, we were investing local tax dollars in our infrastructure, has always been a priority. And almost immediately, the community began planning for improvements to Aurora and the interurban trail and some of our stormwater systems. And then in 2006, the voters voted for a bond measure to improve parks. And then in 2009, council voted to increase vehicle license fees to help county locate and manage the system. And so through surveys and other community input, residents have helped direct these priorities for the capital investments. And over the past year, we've been looking at the next big infrastructure investment that residents have indicated they want, and that's sidewalks. And only about a third of the city's arterials and even fewer of the residential streets currently have sidewalks. And this isn't just a Shoreline issue. You'll see this in other areas and neighborhoods, communities throughout the region, especially when there was a lot of residential development in areas that had previously been unincorporated during the mid-last century. But Shoreline residents have repeatedly identified sidewalks as important, and in this year's resident satisfaction survey, you can kind of see this one.
Slide 4.
Slide 4, thank you. You can see that in this year's resident satisfaction survey, sidewalks were once again a top priority for residents. Less than half of the respondents said that they were satisfied with the availability of sidewalks on major streets, and even fewer satisfied with the availability of sidewalks in their neighborhoods. They've also expressed frustration with the condition of sidewalks that we do currently have. So in this year's survey, out of a list of capital investment options, 64% of the respondents put investing in sidewalk infrastructure as one of their top 2 priorities. So that's what we're responding to.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in here, I think it's important to note that we've been doing this resident survey since 2004. We do it every other year. And you can kind of see a comparison of 2004 to 2016, 2018. But consistently, the satisfaction of level of sidewalks has been lower than a lot of other services. But I think it's also important to recognize, as Tricia stated at the beginning, there were a number of infrastructure issues that the city council needed to adopt when the city became a city. And so sidewalks now have become that issue of how do we respond to the community's needs.
So if you go on to the next slide, it talks about planning for sidewalks. So back in 2011, the city developed a pedestrian plan. It's part of our transportation master plan, and it includes about 153 miles of sidewalks. And that map that's on there shows the entire pedestrian plan. I know it's really small on a piece of paper. There's a little bit more than 78 miles of existing sidewalks. And when we incorporated, we had about 54 miles of sidewalks. And since we've incorporated, we've added just over 17 miles using funds from our capital budget and through grants. Private development has paid for the construction of another 6 miles. And so there's about 75 miles of sidewalk that still need to be constructed to complete this pedestrian plan. And you'll notice that pedestrian plan does not mean sidewalks on every street. That's just these ones that are primarily for connections to and from things. So the need for sidewalks is greater than the resources we have available to complete the pedestrian plan. In order to build out that remaining 75 miles, we estimate it'll cost more than $400 million. And that doesn't include the estimated $110 million needed to repair and maintain our existing sidewalk network. So in order to address the need for repair and maintenance of our existing sidewalk network, the council voted in June to increase the vehicle license fee by an additional $20 and to use those funds specifically for repair of our existing sidewalk network. This will generate about $830,000 in additional revenue. Again, it'll be just focused for sidewalk repair and maintenance. This will significantly boost our efforts, but it's still small compared to the overall need. And so then we really have limited resources when it comes to funding these transportation projects. You can see on this little graph here. We rely on real estate and excise tax, which is known as REIT, a vehicle license fee, known as VLF, lots of acronyms.
And if I could go back, the
Yeah.
real estate excise tax is generated when somebody sells a piece of property. So that is, it's not general property tax, it's from the sale of
Right.
property within the shoreline.
People sell the property, get real estate excise tax. We have the vehicle license fee, which is what you pay on your car tabs, called VLF. And then we also do get some support from our general fund. Over the past 6 years, we, on average, have collected about 1.8 million for transportation projects through these sources. And then that revenue is divided between paving our streets, rebuilding our traffic signals, traffic safety improvements, and sidewalks. And so this is why we really rely so heavily on grants, because that money doesn't go very far. Historically, we spent about $152,000 a year on sidewalk repair and maintenance through our curb, ramp, gutter, sidewalk maintenance program. And new sidewalks have generally been built through grants or as part of other capital projects such as along Aurora. But sidewalks are not cheap. There's a lot of factors that really impact their costs. They have design and planning elements to them. But then and depending on the site, it really can vary. When you get to construction, there's a lot of complexities that come from where are the utilities, where is the storm drainage, how do we accommodate on-street parking, what is needed to make it be accessible for people with disabilities, crossing of driveways, amenity zones, and a whole host of other issues that really complicate and make our sidewalks more expensive than you would think it might be to be. And all of these issues add up, making it more and more expensive. And with that, I'm going to let Debbie talk a little bit about how we came up with this ballot measure and those projects.
So back in 2017, I actually, the city invited residents to submit interest in serving on a citizens advisory committee regarding sidewalks. Council had identified it as a priority, and we always go through a process really to try to invite residents in and give us feedback. So I appointed 15 shoreline residents to participate in this program with the goal of them bringing forward a recommendation on how should we prioritize our sidewalk network and how should we fund our sidewalk needs, looking at both some repair and the need for additional sidewalks. And again, really in response to the community's identification of this is an area that should be addressed. And so those residents gave of their time very willingly, meeting monthly, sometimes a couple times a month. And what we wanted to make sure is we had a broad range. So they represented different areas of the community, it had different interests, different backgrounds, included some people with mobility challenges. So we had a good representation of our community, even though it was only 15 individuals. And I think one of the things that we've heard from them is a value of making sure that there's access and mobility for everyone. It's not just, sidewalks to the level that people that can see, that can have no mobility challenges go faster, but really wanting to make sure everyone could access and get from point to point. And they went through a process to identify some criteria that help in identifying priorities for the various sidewalks within that pedestrian plan. And they basically came down to 4 primary criteria. There were some sub-criteria in those, but looking at safety, equity, proximity, and connectivity. And so as they went through their work, and were coming forward with recommendations, they took a look at what are the funding mechanisms that could be used. And they came forward with, really their preference was to look at a property tax measure. But as the council started looking at what they felt comfortable doing and potentially putting out to the voters, they looked at property tax, sales and use tax, an additional vehicle license fee, or a combination of those things. Ultimately, the city council determined that they were more comfortable putting a sales tax measure on the ballot to fund new sidewalks, primarily new sidewalks. And some of that was in response to the state's action on McCleary, increasing the property tax at the state level for education, and recognizing that there were concerns throughout many communities, including the shoreline community, of property owners, of the impact that property tax was having on them. And so ultimately, they again thought that a sales tax measure was the better option to go forward with for new sidewalks. So in
Are there possible rules or limitations about bonds for this, in particular zero coupon bonds perhaps?
zero coupon bonds.
As an alternative to these operating revenues, kind of?
The state law doesn't really allow for the city to issue zero coupon bonds. Usually for bonding, you either have to have, on the property tax side, you go out to the voters and ask if they're willing to pay additional property tax, so it's a general obligation bond. Or if you had a revenue stream that we're already receiving that we thought we could fund
Match
a
it.
bond from, you could do what's called a councilmanic bond without going for a vote, but then you're obligating some type of way to pay it back internally. The sales tax that is on there, actually what state law says, it can go for up to 20 years, so there is a 20-year limit, and we can bond, basically borrow money up front, do
Use the sales tax
projects,
to
and then
process.
pay it back over the time period that we're collecting the sales tax, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So the measure that will be on the November ballot, it is asking voters if they would approve an increase in sales tax of 0.2%. Our current sales tax rate in Shoreline is 10%. The city doesn't collect all that. We collect actually less than 1/10 of that. But if the voters were to approve this, then the sales tax rate would go to 10.2%. As I already mentioned, it would be in place for 20 years. And the impact of that on when you're buying a taxable good, it's about 2 cents on every $10 of taxable goods. The next slide, so slide 13, shows what the current sales tax rate is for jurisdictions around Shoreline. And you can see there, Linwood has a current sales tax rate of 10.4. Shoreline has a current sales tax rate of 10. If this measure were approved, it would go to 10.2. And so you can see where that fits with our surrounding jurisdictions. We anticipate that over the 20-year period, the 2/10 of the sales tax would probably generate about $59 million. So recognizing that you heard Tricia say earlier that just to complete the sidewalk network of about 75 miles, we're estimating it's about $400 million. So this in no way will complete the entire pedestrian network, but it is a way to accelerate getting a portion of that done. And so in identifying how would the money be used, what projects would happen, the city council identified 12 initial projects. And those are listed on slide 14. It was also in this flyer that I saw some of you looking at there. And these 12 projects, we do not anticipate that they will use the entire $59 million. In fact, we anticipate it probably would be somewhere around 60% of that $59 million. And the agreement of the council was, once these projects are completed, or as they're being completed, if the voters were to approve this, then they would look at what are the priorities of the city and the sidewalk or the pedestrian network plan, and add additional projects. But recognizing that priorities can shift, and wanted to make sure that there was flexibility in the future, and yet there was a commitment initially for people to understand what projects would be first out the door. Yes, Cynthia?
So, I just wanna understand this. So, the initial projects, don't say anything about Ashworth, which is in our neighborhood,
Okay.
does it? Is that correct?
That's correct.
That's correct.
Okay, so potentially, we could not get any sidewalks on Ashworth if priorities in the city changed. Is that what you're saying?
Well, then what I'm saying is, these are the first 12 projects.
Yeah.
I don't know where the Ashford project is off the top of my head in the pedestrian plan, to see where that is in the priority level.
Because it's pretty significant in a long stretch.
It was, with our sidewalk advisory committee, it does score in that high priority range.
Yeah.
If you look at this initial project list map, which is a little bit harder to see.
It's not in, it's not,
Oh, it's not on, oh, it's in the,
no. We just have a list of those. I don't know what.
so I think,
Yeah, we talked about this in.
yeah, you added it to the slide deck. Oh, okay, oh, no, is this
No,
one
no,
in
no,
there?
it's not in there.
Oh,
No.
okay,
That's the,
older one?
mm.
I just printed it. So anyways, Ashworth did score high, it just didn't end up in those initial 12. It was probably without making any commitments, it was like the next tier. And we had Ashworth broken up into like three different segments, I believe, and they all scored, most of those scored relatively high.
So that would probably be, if that's where it really is in that would be probably in the next review of next set of projects that would come on.
That would still fall under this same, sales tax and.
Potentially, yes,
Prop one.
Maybe.
potentially, yeah. So
Maybe.
these are the ones
Okay.
that there's definite commitment for,
Definite commitment on these initial
that's
projects.
right, but we anticipate that the sales tax generator will be greater than the next group of them, and then would be looked at and determined.
Okay.
I think you had your hands next.
So, these are the projects here,
Uh-huh,
it's blue.
uh-huh.
Is that a 20-year goal? In other words, you're saying that the sales tax increase is for 20 years. Is that to do these projects only?
No, these projects would be done in a shorter amount of time. And they would not take all the revenue that's projected to be generated over
In the
20
20
years.
years?
Right, it only takes a portion of that, somewhere probably around the 60% level.
No, well, I have another question, but I think, stick.
If they put sidewalks on Ashworth, it would only be on the east side of Ashworth, cause there's all those irrigation ditches on the west.
Yeah.
So that would cut the roadway down if they tried putting a sidewalk in.
Or we'd have to fill the ditch, right? So we haven't.
It's a big amount of money.
Yeah, so we haven't looked at that level of detail and design on any of these projects. We definitely, those are the things we start to look at after things are done.
So this is just going over people's or people's property then? It's not filling anything in to make them functional then? In other words, a ditch or something that, you'd have to put stormwater through.
Right,
The sidewalk wouldn't be going over the top of it then, is that correct?
well, yeah, in some places we would have to fill the ditch, put a pipe in instead of the ditch, and then put the sidewalk where the
Now
current ditch is.
That's the.
Yeah, so that is part of what it takes to build a sidewalk. That's why I said earlier that sidewalks are really expensive. So we've taken just some generic costs and applied these across all of these projects. Some projects will cost more, some projects will cost less, but we just haven't gone into enough detail to know what side of the street a sidewalk would be in and have
And it'd be
specific
one
costs.
side.
Some would be.
There's a little
one side, some would
footnote
be
on this one
both.
about that.
Yeah, you can see on here,
This side is 3 plus.
yeah, yes.
Okay, well, where would the rainwater go from all the steep cul-de-sacs? I mean, those get full when it's
So-
rainy season.
Right, so we would look at that in the design process, we would make sure we capture all of that. So we would be collecting the water that's in the ditch, we would put that in a pipe, and new water that would go against a curb line would then also go into that storm drainage system, and we would make sure all that storm drainage gets conveyed to a safe place to discharge. There may be some places where instead of filling a ditch, we decide to build a sidewalk behind the ditch if we have enough space. We want some flexibility to be able to look for what is the best solution for the location.
In most cases, that would be on somebody's property.
Potentially not. Certainly the more we have to look at acquiring property, the higher our costs will be. So, we're trying to assume these based upon some costs, assuming we do the standard curb gutter sidewalk. But we also, when we get into design, we would look at flexibility for just something else make more sense.
I'm sorry if I missed this, so if my.
No, not a problem.
How long, are you estimating it would take to do these initial projects? Is that 20 years also, or how long is that?
No, I think we're targeting that we would get these 12 projects built in like 10 to 12 years.
10 to 12 years, okay, thank you.
We really haven't programmed that out, right? It takes us a little while if this was to be approved to get up and running, but
Okay.
I think we're targeting more than that
Yeah,
10 year
and part of,
range.
what that process would be is looking at, are there opportunities to do more than one project at one time, to gain efficiencies, those kinds of things.
And that would come from sales tax.
That's correct. That's where, that funding would come from.
And the use tax, did you already go over that? Or is this only sales tax?
Well, sales and use tax. So depending on if you're buying an item or certain services, an item is sales, retail, certain services are use tax, but it's the same rate.
Oh, God, okay.
So if you
Sales
bought,
and use
so
tax.
if you bought a house in Shoreline, you would add that to the,
No, there's no sales tax on
property?
buying a house.
Yeah.
Now, when builders buy the materials for a house, like lumber, they may pay the sales tax on that. Yeah, but you don't pay, your cost of your house includes all those costs that a builder paid.
And so you'll be collecting all this money along the way, this 2%.
2/10.
0.2%, sorry.
Yeah.
And then, so is there a time limit that you have to spend it by? If there's like this 20 years that it's gonna be collected for according to this Proposition 1, do you have to spend it before that 20 years is up? Or is there, if there's money left over at the end of 20 years, what happens to that money?
Well, hopefully what you would do is, you want to try to spend it within the 20-year period.
Right, yeah.
That's the goal. Obviously, with sales tax, it's always can be a little bit difficult in projecting exactly how much you're gonna collect as the economy goes up and down. And so, you would try to expend as much as you can. I'm assuming, and this would be a question we'd have to just clarify, is if there was some difference at the end of the 20 years that hadn't been fully expended, that we would, program that and get, anything that's remaining. But the goal would be to maximize getting it done within that 20 years.
So is legally, can the money only be used for this?
Yes, so on slide 15 is actually the ballot measure that you will see on your ballot, and we are legally restricted to use the sales tax as it is stated in the ballot measure, so.
You'd mentioned in the survey that was done that 60-some% of people listed sidewalks as number 1 and 2. Do you know what the other top 2 or 3 items were?
I think if I remember right,
I don't remember.
road maintenance, sidewalks. It may be, I'd have to go back and look. But that information is available on the city's website, and I'm glad to send it to Cynthia to send out. But we have a link that has all of the results.
That'd be great.
Questions? Yes?
Yeah, going back to the vehicle license fee, the $20. So I understand that that's for repairs of sidewalks, and from looking at this, it looks like you basically quadrupled the budget that you can use. Or in that little graph, there's
Right, yeah.
like the 200,000 right now
Right.
that you've got towards sidewalks. You're bumping up to like 800,000.
Right.
So how, I know that we already have sidewalks, and I know that the sidewalk prioritization committee really said, hey, we need to fix some of these.
Right.
Like, how much, or how much will that get you in fixing the sidewalks with that fee? In terms of can you fix a mile a year, or 5 miles a year, or,
Yeah.
can you give us some ballpark to understand?
We're gonna say it depends.
Yeah,
No,
I know
that's
it
a
totally
really
depends.
hard
Yeah.
one to do that because there's so many things wrapped into it, because something like replacing a curb ramp
Yeah.
to meet ADA accessibility it can be like $10,000 for one curb ramp.
Right.
Or you could get a segment of sidewalk where you only need to replace 1 or 2 panels, and that might be relatively low cost. So it really comes down to what do we mix and match as far as priorities and what do we choose to do.
Got it.
So it doesn't get us as far as we would like, but it gets us a lot farther than the funding we have now.
Yeah, cause it's quadruple,
Right,
basically what you're able to spend right now.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and when we estimated, what it would do to fix all the existing sidewalk perfectly, was about 110 million. So,
Yeah, more than that now at this point.
yeah, yeah. So it
Cost
took a
goes
while,
up,
but
cost goes
obviously,
up every day.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
we're going through a process right now to help
Okay.
prioritize
Yeah,
what
okay,
those fixes should be.
cool.
When they did the Aurora project, there was a guideline, I was involved in some of that,
Oh, okay.
that they had the sidewalks on Aurora at least, I don't know if they apply to the side streets or not, have to be accessible to 2 wheelchairs pass. So, they have to be
That wide.
that wide.
Mm-hmm.
Do these have to be that wide, and do the repairs have to be done to make them that wide?
No.
Like 155th between Aurora and Meridian. I mean, the sidewalks are terrible when they're this wide. Does that have to address that issue?
No, on Aurora, it was a decision to have sidewalks that were 7.5.
But it was
feet
something
wide.
they had to, it was a guideline
It was
they
a
had to go
guideline,
by.
right.
Because they were putting sidewalks in.
So the standard for the American with Disabilities Act is that they need to be 48 inches. So 4 feet. Our standard in a residential area or in front of single-family homes is a 5-foot sidewalk. If you're in front of commercial or apartments or non-single-family use, then we want the 8-foot sidewalks.
So they do have to be wider than they are now.
Well, depending on where you're at, right? So there are some around town that are only 3 feet wide.
Yeah.
They're not ADA accessible.
Well, they have the ramps on the cross streets,
But they
and they're
don't,
there, but they're very narrow.
right, so they don't meet the guidelines for the American Disabilities
Exactly.
Act. So we would be looking at, for sidewalk repair, we'd be looking to replace those.
At 4 feet, if they were.
4 feet or
replaced.
5 feet is
Yeah.
our standard.
Okay.
We'd be trying to replace things at 5 feet. Sometimes we have to pinch them narrower.
I just want to clarify the numbers here. So on this one, you're saying right now, out of whatever budget we currently have, we approximately have $150,000 to spend on sidewalks.
Sidewalk
maintenance.
repair, yeah.
So we put this $20 per tab fee on, and that is going to give us another $830,000 to add to the maintenance of the sidewalks. So now we're asking for 0.2% to build new sidewalks. How much is that gonna get us?
The 2/10.
Yeah.
We estimate over the 20 years, it'd be about $59 million.
So, but per year, how much are you looking to spend on an
Well, if you divide that by 20, it's around, I gotta do math, at 3 million a year. I mean,
Yeah, okay.
But
Yeah.
we do expect that you
It'll
collect
increase over
more.
time.
Right.
yeah, that's right,
Yeah,
yeah, so it'll be
start
less
out
at
lower
the
and go
beginning,
up.
and, yeah,
Yeah.
Okay.
assuming that there's growth in sales tax.
Prices, underlying prices go up.
Yeah.
Real quickly, maybe 2 things. Is there any consideration here of putting utilities underground as we put sidewalks in? Especially, wires hanging up that look like terrible. I know that's expensive.
And all
It's
those-
super
That's
expensive.
That's
Yeah.
the problem.
And really, Seattle City Lights policy, if you do undergrounding, is then the ratepayers in the local jurisdiction, they add the cost to basically your electric rates, to cover that. So it's very significant, so we have not anticipated doing that.
And there's charges on my city light bill for Aurora, for North City, I think for one other place. It adds up.
Yeah.
Okay, someplace I read, and I don't remember where it was, I think it was like in some posting on Nextdoor, where they made a big deal about sidewalks on 175th, and it's not listed here.
So.
What happened to that?
So 175th, we have a capital project funded separately. And so it's not on this list because we're moving forward with the design of that project. separate from this. So,
You mean it's gonna happen?
yes. But-
Well, there's nothing wrong with the sidewalk on the south side. It's a beautiful sidewalk. But how can they add a sidewalk on the north side? You can't here.
Well, it's part of a much larger capital project, so we do have a capital improvement plan in our 6-year capital budget to design, to improve this whole corridor from I-5 all the way up to just that direction of City Hall. That would improve traffic safety, traffic operations at the signal with Meridian and 175th, and put sidewalk or pedestrian facilities and bike facilities along this corridor.
So you're saying between Meridian and Stone or whatever,
Right, but
on the north side,
that's the goal of the project.
how's it gonna be accomplished? What are you gonna do with the boulders that are holding our property in place?
So those would be things that would be studied through the design.
And then in the next block, that one house that you have to go down the driveway, you would have to fill in a tremendous amount of dirt to get it up here.
Yeah, we didn't say it was gonna be easy.
It's gonna be costly,
It's gonna be
extremely costly.
And I guess I would just add, we don't have any money for construction of that project or anything. We have some grant money to look at design.
Yeah, but we do have transportation impact fees that can help fund that construction.
You brought up one other subject that I was gonna talk about later, but you said this was for pedestrians and bicycles. Is that correct? Are bicycles gonna be allowed on the sidewalks?
No, I think she was talking about the design of the 175th corridor.
Sure, I
Yeah,
know where
but
she,
no,
exactly
no,
where she was
this is
talking
for-
about, but bicycles are my issue why I'm here. Because are they not, or are they allowed to be on the sidewalks? Because I've been hit by a bicycle already, and that's on the trail. That's a wide trail. Now, if you've got a narrow sidewalk with a bicycle on it,
They shouldn't be.
I know they shouldn't be
They
on
shouldn't be
there,
on the
but
sidewalk,
they're,
they should
but
use
they're,
the
but they're
roadway.
allowed to be, is that correct?
I don't know if there's anything that prohibits.
Yeah, I don't know if our code precludes them from being on the sidewalks or not.
I think they are allowed.
Yeah, I think
They are
so as
allowed on
well.
Aurora, I know that for sure.
I mean, the rules in Seattle, cause I've biked a fair amount from between here and Seattle,
Yeah.
is that you can be on the sidewalk, but you need to be going extremely slow.
Well,
So
it's a
that's-
15
so
mile an hour
that's-
speed limit, that's pretty fast.
No, but like, you need, not on the trail, but the
Sure,
rules in
trail.
Seattle are, if you're on the sidewalk, you gotta be going slow. And I would assume that there was something comparable.
Yeah. I don't,
Whether or not it's put into practice,
Yeah.
you know, or people
Enforcement's
observe it, right, that's a totally different story. But like, that's what the rules are.
Sure.
Yeah.
But they can be allowed on the sidewalks, that's,
Yeah, there's nothing that prohibits.
On busy streets like Meridian, sometimes I ride my bike on the sidewalk, but if I come across a pedestrian, I slow down to almost nothing, and, you know, I mean, it's,
that's the exception rather than the rule.
yeah.
Well, and bicyclists used to say coming up on your lap, I don't hear them ever
Or
say it
bell or
anymore.
something else. I've gotten cussed at because I
Yeah.
asked them to slow down, cause I was walking my
Hmm.
grandchildren and took verbal abuse for it, and that's on the trail.
Let's do that.
If it
We've
happens-
actually put signs up on the trail.
Yeah,
Ask people to
I
ring
said
the
it all,
bell,
I
yeah.
walked by it.
Yeah.
I came in late, so if this has been covered, just tell me and I'll pick it up somewhere else. But is there any involvement with the sidewalks in the neighborhood from the builders and developers? I'm remembering that it used to be, when a new home was built, you
Yes.
could put a sidewalk out front, and nobody in my neighborhood did. They paid something, they got some other give
Oh,
or
I see.
take.
We don't have a sidewalk in Luffy anymore. I
Okay.
think at one time the city did.
Yeah.
Development is required to put in frontage improvements. The only exception we have, and Tricia, correct me if I'm wrong, is if it's a single family home and they're only doing one home.
Right.
They don't have to do that.
If it's only just doing one home because it.
Then there's no sidewalk has to be put in that.
Right, but that is by far the majority of the development that occurs is more than one single family home,
Sure.
multifamily, commercial, they're
It's
all
just the way
required.
it's- Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering if there's any help for some of the projects outside this more Main Street
Yeah, I mean,
stuff?
I think, the one thing that
Develop
you did
more
say is,
neighborhoody?
yeah, I mean, private development has basically paid for 7 miles of sidewalks since the city incorporated back in 1995. And they're continuing to do more as.
And underground utilities, is that correct?
They have to.
All of the ones that I've seen are underground utilities.
So they have to underground to their new building,
Right.
right? So, but they don't have to underground for like
No,
the
no,
whole
people
corridor, they
next
just
door.
have to underground their service.
Okay. All right, so, we have kept, these lovely people here longer than we said we would.
Oh, no, not a problem.
And, so I'd like to, if we could, move along.
Okay.
And-
Thank you.
And we'll just, thank you both very much.
Okay, you're welcome, you're welcome.
Move this out here. And we'll bring your chairs up. You could get a beverage if you want.
Yeah, there's, I was even talking.
Yes. So the first thing that I would like to ask you each to do, once you get your beverages and get settled, and I'm gonna hand out pieces of paper, because the way we're gonna do this is that, disregard, this is paper recycling, disregard what's printed on the back. Is that, if you have questions for the, people on the panel here, you can write them down and hand them to me, and then I will ask them, and both of the panelists will answer. I'll just put a pile of them here.
In fairness, we should mention that at the moment, this is being recorded. We like to always have our guests have the option of suggesting that should not be done. All that happens is we put it on a little website, and we get a couple of thousand hits a month, not many. And it sits there for a long time. So you can go over it if you want, or we can turn it off if you don't mind, if you want. Okay,
It's fine.
fine.
Share the wealth of knowledge.
Okay, so, the first thing that I would like to ask you to do, if you could, is to, just briefly tell us, each of you taking a turn, who you are and what got you interested in, becoming part of, whatever, side of this issue you have, become part of. So just introduce yourself and talk about that, please.
Can you start with that? Yeah, Dustin McIntyre. I am the chair of the Prop 1 No Committee. We call ourselves the Sidewalk Reprioritization Committee. And I got involved because we moved to Shoreline in 2016 in July. And we were pregnant with our first and only daughter. Growing, or having her grow up and pushing her around in the Ridgecrest neighborhood. We moved out of Seattle, understood we were not in a very dense community, and we liked the rural, semi-rural aspect of it, being close into the city. But what few sidewalks that we had there were terribly damaged, and anybody who's seen Fifth Avenue Northeast, enough said, and then there's the story the rest of the city. So I actually got involved in the Sidewalk Advisory Committee that Debbie referred to. You actually see my picture on the slide that they actually showed the group photo. So I was on that committee, and so I actually helped contribute to some of the recommendations. They alluded to the recommendations, and part of why I'm here in the no side is partially, honestly, civic duty. We are really letting the rest of the city understand for the first time what this proposal is, and people really thinking about it deeply. So we thought it would be good to give voice to the people that maybe object to the actual method that they're funding it, not opposed to sidewalks. And really just trying to make sure that the voice of the actual Sidewalk Advisory Committee is represented in the recommendations that we put forward that weren't fully adopted by the city. So that's that.
Thank you. Nick?
I'm Nick. My wife and 2 young girls live down right around the corner on Ashworth, actually. And part of the reason that I joined the Yes for Prop 1 committee is because I see this as a huge opportunity for us to start getting sidewalks. And if you, I mean, all of you are from Meridian Park, and I walk around, and the sidewalks are disjointed at best. I, you know, sometimes work from my living room, and I look out on the street and I watch my elderly neighbor come down and get the mail without sidewalks, while trucks, you know, come flying up Ashworth doing 35, 40 miles an hour. I see kids riding bicycles without sidewalks. I see a woman that has a very clear physical disability, making her way to the bus every morning and making her way home every night, and doesn't have a safe place to walk. And the way I see it is Ashworth, to answer, I think, Cynthia's previous question, as far as I understand the prioritization plan, Ashworth is about number 20 on the list. And the way that I see it is, if we don't pass a measure and pass Prop 1 now and start moving into action, what's gonna happen is any momentum that was built through the Sidewalk Advisory Committee, through the satisfaction surveys, all that momentum will be lost in our community, and it'll be another year or 2 or 3 or 4 before a new proposal comes back to the voters. And so I see this as a really pressing issue. And frankly, I want my little girls to be able to walk on my street without getting plowed by a car.
Great, thank you. Does someone have a question for me to ask? Anyone? See people
Well, I'm
ready.
gonna take, I do, I
Okay.
guess.
So,
I'm gonna take-
can you write it down, please?
Oh,
You have it written down?
no, I don't have anything.
Okay,
I borrowed one of these from over there.
Okay,
great.
I'm gonna use that.
And here's why we're writing it down, because we're not gonna have it be sort of a back and forth. We're just
okay,
gonna have
that's
it be
fine.
something where it's moderated. There are 3 minutes each for them to answer the question,
Oh, we
so.
were timed? I
Yes.
didn't know we were timed.
Time, yes.
How did
And
I
you
do
did
on my
very
time?
well.
Did I
did
run
well,
over
2
3
and a half minutes.
2 and a half, okay.
So,
Next
So
time
I
I'll
will
push it
ask
a
you
little
another
bit.
question while you are, while we're waiting. So, and you kind of addressed this, Nick, in your, statement here, but, so how do you see, Proposition 1 serving Meridian Park neighborhood?
Yeah, sure, I'm happy to. So, if you look on the prioritization plan, as I understand it, it puts it, I shouldn't say theoretically, but given funding, there would be sidewalks going down both sides of Ashworth from 185th to 155th. And to me, that's right down the middle of Meridian Park. That is where kids walk regularly. There's also cross-hatching, and you can see it. You can see it a little bit on the slides. Slide is the 3rd page. Oh, you can't see that. I can barely see that. But there's also a cross-hatching of other sidewalks that would go, I believe, at 165th from Aurora down to Meridian, and a couple other spots where they would put in sidewalks. So I see, at least in the prioritization plan, I see a really good opportunity in the future. But it's not until after we let City Council and let Proposition 1 pass and get through the other sidewalks they've already prioritized.
And then I'll answer the same one.
Yes, please.
Right, so I can't sit here and say that you won't get a single dollar from Prop 1 because clearly we see the list of projects that are here that none of those fall within your specific neighborhood. The city is correct that this is initial 4 or 5 miles of new sidewalks, and if all if all 60 million comes in, you might get something down the list. So that makes sense that you'll want to vote for a tax, benefit of the many, and eventually you get to yours on the list. The concern that we have, even helping build the prioritization matrix, is that the way that the projects were actually prioritized really favors those major streets. Part of the satisfaction survey, you'll note that almost half the people, and if you include neutrals, about half the people say, we have enough sidewalks on Aurora, 175th, 155th, and where we do have them, they're broken. That's the part that we want to invest in. So something like 175th is going to get a lot more priority. Something like 15th Northeast in Ridgecrest or Bollinger is going to get a lot more priority because it has a high speed limit and it's classified as a major arterial. And I understand safety is an important criteria that people want, but that almost gives those projects 40% of their total ranking. It doesn't consider where people actually walk. And the city told us in the committee specifically, we simply can't quantify where the people actually live and actually use the sidewalks. So we see it as a cars first prioritization list, but we also understand that sidewalks are where most of the people already live, and those sidewalks that do exist over the last 50, 60, 70 years really need that repair. And that's where the VLF comes in, but it doesn't go far enough. And so that's why we see it as a miss with Prop 1, that we're going so heavily on all of these other major streets that are getting new sidewalks instead of in the neighborhoods that people want.
Thank you. I have another question here. Ashworth also has parking. How would that be impacted by sidewalks? This is between 175th and 155th.
So Ashworth has parking. How would it be affected by sidewalks? I think the city touched on that when Tricia and Debbie were here moments ago, that a lot of the projects aren't fully proven on the ground. So when they do cost estimates, they can look at a segment and generally where they fall as like a type of street and what utilities are there. But things like, and again, sorry for bringing up Ridgecrest, but that's my experience. When they did the bike lanes on 5th Avenue Northeast, it disrupted a lot of parking, and they tried to minimize that disruption to people. But what's good in theory on paper doesn't always apply to how people actually want it if they're not able to give enough feedback. So I can't specifically say how that project would affect parking, and I don't know that the city can even do that because, again, they haven't really been ground proven. So, and that also relates to cost, like you guys suggested.
Great.
Yeah,
Same question about it has parking on the side. How would that be impacted by sidewalks between 175th and 155th?
Yeah, I think Dustin gave a great answer. The city doesn't have, as far as I understand it, the city doesn't have a full plan on every single sidewalk. And nor do I believe that they should, because the amount of resources that it would take to go out and engineer all those things prior to having funding in place makes absolutely no sense. So, I think that they're doing a really great job of being fiscally conservative and thoughtful about looking at, where to put sidewalks and saying, hey, it seems like the committee and others want the sidewalks here, and we'll sort out the minutia and the details once we get some funding measures in place to make sure that we can engineer them properly. So your parking question, I have no idea. But I would be a little bummed if there wasn't some parking there, so.
If there wasn't?
If there wasn't, yeah, I live on Ashworth, so,
Sidewalk would take that away.
If you're going to have company, you'd like to have a couple of places.
And actually, technically, I don't think it would take it away, because across from my house, there happens to be one of the tiny little stretches of sidewalk, and there is some parking available, so, I don't think that that's necessarily true.
But it does narrow the street. If you park.
Or goes into the easement, what is technically right away.
Okay. All right, next question. On the less busy streets, why do you feel we need sidewalks on both sides of the street? Why not one side and make the sidewalk 6 to 8 feet wide?
So I'll answer that. I wasn't on the sidewalk prioritization committee, and you have to look at the prioritization plan to actually understand which sidewalks have each side listed. You can find it online, just Google shoreline sidewalks, and you can find a prioritization map. There is one in the slides, which you won't be able to read, but I would, if you have questions about very specific projects, I'd say, look at that map, and, it's really user-friendly, and you can zoom in and zoom out, and it'll tell you which ones have sidewalks going down each side and which ones don't.
So the specific question about sidewalks on both for small streets?
It says, on the less busy streets, why do you feel we need sidewalks on both sides of the street?
Yeah.
Why not one side and make the sidewalk 6 to 8 feet wide?
Right. So a particular project comes to mind, I believe it's Meridian up in Echo Lake. And that sidewalk, that project in particular is on the website a lot, on the city site, because it's a bus stop and it's an island. And there's 0 sidewalks going to the island. And admittedly, that looks bad. And part of the priority is that matrix that we came up as a committee is it on a bus route and people presumably need to walk to the street, then yeah, it should get more criteria than something, like my street, that's just a very small little feeder. I'll probably never see a sidewalk on my street. I agree that it should go to where the transit, where people actually need to go. The trick about Meridian is that it has a sidewalk on the other side of the street, and what you don't see is that that's actually a crosswalk that could simply be painted in signal that could allow somebody to go directly to that bus island. And furthermore, beyond the trees, it's actually the interurban trail. And so there are lower cost alternatives that we could get through, example, the VLF that they already imposed on the city, that can get people to those bus stops without fully paving 6-7 foot wide sidewalks, on all of these major arterials, when there can be smarter cost-saving measures to get people to and from those stops safely. So those are some of the concerns that we have in terms of the project funding in the particular list that they're going to move forward with, proposing.
Thank you. What are 3 ideas the committee supported but the city did not accept?
Probably makes sense to start with me on that one. So I can give you a couple specifically. One of them I touched on earlier, which was the way that we ranked the safety. The residents at the open house overwhelmingly said safety is the biggest concern. Yes, safe sidewalks, no. It's a good slogan and I agree. But I actually mentioned on more than one occasion at the onset, we're really overweighting the confluence of all of the cars and the speed that they're actually traveling, because 175th is already going to be rated 35 miles an hour, and it's also a major arterial, so you're giving it double credit. So that's one thing that I called out. The other part was the funding mechanism itself that the city touched on. By a 2-to-1 ratio, the committee actually recommended to do a property tax. Yes, it's politically sensitive. Yes, we understood that new sidewalks could potentially take that risk if people really want to get that boost. Because what's more important is funding the repair of the ones that we already have, in the opinion of the committee as well as our particular political committee. So the mechanism to use sales tax for new sidewalks as this massive regressive, not massively regressive, it's a regressive tax and it impacts a lot of people's fixed incomes. And it's a massive outlay of cost without that sort of universal benefit when you're talking about 12 projects to start with. So that's the second one. And the third one is the actual investment mix. So I said 2-to-1 margin, and I just touched on it on my other answer. And it's also dedicating the funding towards fixing first. The $20 VLF only gets us that less than $1 million a year, and it only repairs about 50 of the total 60 miles that aren't actually ADA compliant. If we're gonna throw a boost on something, we recommend doing it for the sidewalks where they are in place now, getting from 3 feet to 3 to 4 to 5, etc. So those are the 3 main things that as a committee we tried to go forward to. I guess that's technically 2.5 though, because the city did again impose the VLF earlier in June to fund some repairs, but not at the same level that we recommend.
Thank you. Is there anything that you'd like to add?
I wasn't on the committee.
Let's say that, yeah. Unfortunate kind of bias there. I could try to offer some pro options, because as a committee we did also say that
Great.
We should fund the maintenance first. So it's the flip side of the thing I just said, which is the city did actually agree to that mechanism to make sure there's some funding for maintenance, and then putting to a vote the way that they can for the new. So I said that there was something that they actually accepted.
Great. Thank you. Here's one. Can you detail your concerns as a member of the sidewalk committee? Sorry, this is lopsided.
Yeah, maybe if there's another one, you can
tailor it. We can tailor another one for you.
You can directly challenge it. I don't want to talk the time. So I'm sorry, I got distracted by the
Can you
lopsided.
detail your concerns as a member of the sidewalk committee?
Okay. I think in fairness, I'll say that I've pretty much expressed my concerns as a member of the committee. The thing, you know, my statements and against are mostly why. Now, I will say I completely respect the rest of the committee, and I'm not here with sour grapes, but again, I say some of the recommendations that the committee put forward that weren't accepted, and again, my voice in particular, I'm wanting to at least air some of that and just give transparency to the process.
Alright, how about this one? Nick, you talked about, what got you interested in, being on the pro side of this. Was there anything else that you wanted to add to that? Or anything that you've learned since you started?
I mean, here's my general perspective. So, and I didn't engage in the sidewalk committee. I just saw what looked like a good initiative and wanted to put my weight behind it. And so I'm not coming to this as an expert in sidewalks. I'm coming to it as like a citizen that just wants to see sidewalks. And I want to see sidewalks because I've got 2 little girls. And I gave lots of examples of the people that I see walking down my street. I think the process of government and the process of these types of conversations is never perfect. And what I get gravely concerned about is that this will end up, that will let, perfection get in the way of good enough. And to me, when I look at Prop 1, I go, you know what? This proposition is good enough. Like, yes, it is regressive because we have no other tax systems to use. Washington State doesn't have an income tax. Therefore, our taxing is regressive. So if people are upset about regressive tax, it's like the only tool that there is, or one of the very, very few tools that there are. So, so I kind of look at it and say, hey, I want my community to be mobile, and we're going to continue to grow, especially with the light rail coming here. And either we're going to get dragged along and not have smart development and smart growth, or we're going to start making some strategic and thoughtful investments right now, November 6th, right now. Else we're going to kick the can down the road another couple of years, and then it'll be far too late.
Okay. Let's see here. Guardrails, fences on 175th sidewalks. Can I hear more about that?
Sure.
Question?
It's a marvelous sidewalk on the south side of 175th, Trader Joe's going toward Ashworth. I happen to live on Ashworth too. But boy, those cars are whizzing by there. And, I walk by there, but I think twice about it, all it takes is somebody's, a little tipsy that day and you're toast. Not that, like there's nice green metal fencing there further on 175th across from the library and that sort of thing. You probably remember that. I don't know if there's been any discussion about putting up that sort of thing between the fast-moving traffic and the pedestrians, particularly from Ashworth down to the school. You see all these kids and their little au pairs and moms and dads and everybody going up and down there. And boy, a lot of them could get wiped out if somebody had a heart attack on 175th or whatever.
Just a distracted kid steps off the curb.
Yeah, there you go.
Going on for time, if you want to respond first.
No,
okay. So that was definitely considered too, because as a committee at least, and I'll say again, the sidewalk advisory, I know I kind of have 2 hats, so if there's any confusion on what I'm referring to, please ask. So as the sidewalk committee, we did try to consider what are the alternative treatments that aren't just full-on paved sidewalks. And there was, admittedly concern about devaluing or working below city code standards. So when you're talking about any project that's going to be touched, it's gonna be pretty much the full curve and standard sidewalk that you see. This particular street, when you're talking about that type of improvement, we agree that those are the types of small costs that we could potentially fund within, say, the existing VLF revenue that we're getting. And when I say existing, it was approved in June of this year, but you won't see it on your tabs until starting about next month. So you're actually gonna start paying it next month and they'll start receiving that revenue already for next year. So that would be something that we would recommend doing for the places where people actually walk. And the last thing I'll say quickly about that is it also touches on the safety issue where I said you're giving value to fund investments for new sidewalks on streets like this, where we actually looked in the data, we saw that when you do have marked intersections and serious crosswalks and large sidewalk areas, there are actually more incidences of pedestrians versus cars in where it's actually paved. It makes sense because then if you pave it, people can walk there. But it is a false correlation to say that if we build a sidewalk, you won't get any incidents. I'm not, fudging the numbers on that. There's a direct correlation between people don't really want to walk if they don't have to on this busy street, and they walk where it's quieter a block over, even if there's no sidewalk. And that's what I was talking about in terms of showing where the foot traffic actually is.
Yeah.
If you build it, they will come. It's a hard argument. Again, I can't say causality, but that's just one of the things we observed.
Yeah. So, speaking to the guardrails on, so one, just picking up on what was just said, the next near through street is 167th. So for,
that's
anybody to, you're gonna have a long puff. And I too, get quite nervous, walking up and down there and walk to Trader Joe's regularly. So I think the VLF is great to see because theoretically that boost to the funds could go and fund something like that. And Proposition 1, which would increase the additional sales and use tax, after spending the 60% roughly on the first 12 projects, the remaining 40% will be used for interest payments and other projects, and that could be another project that goes under consideration. So again, I come back to saying hey, Proposition 1 makes a lot of sense to me.
Okay, thank you. Repairing old sidewalks, as 155th, does this impact the lanes of travel or private property because they are so narrow? The old sidewalks are so narrow.
Yeah, I'll acknowledge that if.
And the trees.
Trees.
There's trees all the way along there. How do you make a larger, that's why I asked a question earlier, how do you put a 5-foot or a 4-foot sidewalk in there when two people can't pass on it now?
Right, yeah, that's where each project definitely will vary. So repairing a stretch of sidewalk could be, like the city said, as much as grinding down a part or just filling in the gap or replacing a panel, but some of them admittedly are full-on sections, and part of that you're going to look at the easement on that person's property, and even my fence that technically sits. When I bought the house, it's in the right-of-way, and if the city wanted to put a sidewalk that's really wide, I might lose the fence, and people get frustrated about that, but that's the law, it's in the deed, etc. So those are more expensive projects, and we completely agree that repair isn't just 10 cents to the dollar. Some of them are 50% or 100% of a full sidewalk.
So that doesn't live up to that building a new one then? It's not taking a old one out and putting a brand new one in?
Most of those repairs don't require a full segment to be completely lifted and replaced. Some of them do cost more money, which is where we believe even the added almost $900,000 investment, you are going to find those projects that you need to do all over the city. So it's not just something you want to do on a maintenance small side program.
Thank you, Dustin. Nick?
Can I actually ask a question of Dustin really quickly? This is it's related to because you're much more knowledgeable about this stuff than I am. But what is the right-of-way setback? What is that lane typically in front of somebody's house?
Honestly, I don't know if there's a hard and fast answer for every single house. I just know, like, I had to do a survey recently for a potential remodel thing in the backyard, and so it's like actually a wedge. So whoever put the fence up didn't really do it on
It's the
purpose.
water meter.
Yeah, and it also depends because, you know,
Mostly
there's
it's the
drainage
water meter,
ditches, and
yeah.
sometimes that's 5 to 10 feet setback off of where the pavement is, because there's utilities and from the unincorporated history.
Yeah, we're on just a little side
Yeah.
road, and it was 30 feet from the center of the road. So you just take the high point of the road, measure 30 feet in, and it's not mine.
You're maintaining.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So when we did the retaining wall, we put it back there.
That's right, that's right, yeah.
So I have another question here. Who do you see will be most positively impacted in our neighborhood, Meridian Park neighborhood, by Proposition 1? And then the second question that I'm gonna ask after you answer that one is gonna be, who do you see is going to be most negatively impacted by Proposition 1? So, first one, go on the who do you see is gonna be most positively impacted, and you can decide who's gonna go first. And that would be in Meridian Park.
Okay, so, and we get 3 minutes to answer each question?
Yes.
Well,
you can
I'm doing the rapid.
You don't have to do.
Oh, no, I want all 3 minutes.
You want all 3 minutes?
That's
Go
the
for it.
thing.
Okay.
And who's gonna be most positively affected
Yes.
by
First
Proposition 1?
In Meridian Park.
In Meridian Park.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so it's odd having questions come from the piece of paper because I'm not sure who to look at. But
I wrote this.
oh, you did? Okay, great. I will speak to you, Cynthia.
But I'm asking it on behalf of our neighborhood.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the way I see it is, you know, none of the new projects that are slated are in Meridian Park, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah.
And I'm not super happy about that. And if you would ask me, I would have prioritized Ashworth, right? But I also get the impression that if I asked Dustin where he would prioritize, he might say, you know, a sidewalk in his neighborhood. And if I asked somebody down in Richmond Beach, they'd probably say a sidewalk in their neighborhood. And so the way I see it is that a group of citizens came together and put together a nice little plan to execute against. And after that plan gets underway, then there's still more money to be used to create sidewalks. And so I think the long-term winners here are actually our kids. You know, when you hear these first 12 sidewalks will be 10 years out, you know, my little girls will be 12 and 10 years old before they actually start seeing something get created, which is right around the time that I really want them to be safe. So I see them as benefiting hugely. I also see, well, I focus primarily on that.
Great, thank you very much. Justin?
Yeah, that's totally right, that at the onset, they said it might be the first 10 years when it takes to get through these first projects. And that will be almost, you know, a generation, a half generation until they start working that way down the list. So I am gonna speak to the actual intent of the question, which was who will be benefited. And I think that's entirely right. So it's gonna take a little bit of time. But you also, again, as a citizen, you can't just say, well, you know, what about mine? The satisfaction survey said people were concerned about their neighborhood, not on the major streets, because people want to walk in their neighborhood and they want to get to, you know, the places where they can actually go and shop. So we do want the actual prioritization list and the criteria you use to reflect where people actually want to go to in each respective neighborhood, and that's definitely something we found was missing. The objective, the data-driven criteria was intended to be so you don't have people saying, well, what about me, you left me out, mine is more important than the other one. Because you could say, look at activity centers, look at bus routes, and look at where people, you know, as a proxy metric, where do they want to go? We do think that 10 years ago, the Vision 2029 thing